It is not about the digital future of corporate reporting, but it is about corporate reporting of the digital future. Now, Sander, I hope you can explain that.
I'll give it a shot. Please. Thank you, Wim. Yeah, so I guess I'm here to provide the outside-in view, which also means I don't know almost anybody here except for you two guys. And yeah, let's just give it a shot and see what I can contribute to this discussion. So I always use these kind of sessions for a bit of commercial. This is my book, We Are Big Data. So if you didn't buy it yet, you should. And everything that I say in here will be in this book further explained. You can also wait for my new book, actually. It's called Trust in a Smart Society. It will appear in November, so then you have a nice Christmas gift. I'm a partner at KPMG responsible for our data and analytics services, but I'm also a professor in big data ecosystems at the University of Amsterdam. And I will sort of mix and match my experiences in both to come up with this story that I will tell you now. And what I'm here to tell you is that algorithms are basically impacting our lives in an enormous level, and far further probably than any of you realize at the moment. And I created here a slide which shows you a couple of examples. And it starts, for example, with the gates that you have at the subways. Right? So if you go back 10, 15 years, and if you actually wanted to go into the subway without a ticket, you could. Huh? You could buy a ticket, but you could also ignore the law and go into the subway and not buy a ticket. You would risk that you would get a fine, but it was still your own decision. These days you can't, because every subway has these gates, and if you don't buy a ticket, you can simply not pass the gates. So in a sense, that system has taken over that decision from you. And it goes much further than law ever did. Because law just said that you had to buy a ticket, but this gate also tells you where you can enter the station and where you cannot. This gate tells you that you cannot say goodbye to anybody close to the train. Right? So systems and the algorithms in these systems have far more impact on our lives than laws ever did and regulations ever did, even when these systems are not obligatory. So this picture on the bottom right is a driver that actually decides to drive through wet concrete because his navigation system told him that that's a smart idea to do. And you all have experienced these kind of decisions. You slavishly follow, well, maybe not this one, but I can probably come up with a few that you did. Yeah. There's even a name for this. It's called invisible barbed wire. It's a term that was coined by Evgeny Morozov. It's a famous philosopher on big data. And he says, our lives are more or less guided by invisible barbed wire. And he even went so far as calling this a limitation of our democracy. And when he coined that term, I was like, whoa, that's a little bit far to call that a limitation of our democracy. But these days, when you have all the fake news and the impact on elections of algorithms, you start to realize that he, in fact, is right. There's only one thing that he's not right about, and that's the invisible part. Algorithms at the moment are not invisible. That guy in the right bottom corner, he realizes very well that that algorithm is making him do something that he doesn't like, and he gets annoyed by it. And we all know that feeling. It's the feeling when you get back from your holiday, and on every web page you look, you see that same apartment where you just went to for half the price. That annoying feeling, that's the barbed wire that you're feeling. And give it 5 years, give it 10 years, and then that annoying feeling will be gone. These algorithms will be so good that we know that you just went to that apartment. So we won't show you that advertisement anymore, right? So that means that we are in sort of a very special moment in time. We are in the moment in time where we still see these algorithms doing the stuff that we don't like them to do. 10 years from now, they still impact our decisions, but we won't see it anymore. And that means that we have 5 years, maybe 10 years, to come up with regulations to make sure that these algorithms stay within the boundaries that we, as a society, want them to have. And that's, I think, why it is key that we now start thinking about how you integrate this in regulations and how you integrate this in corporate reporting. Now there is another development that is impacting all of this, and that's what I'm trying to show here. So far, we've been working more or less with single firms, single organizations that are delivering a service around data or around analytics. But that's changing. We are moving away from single companies providing services to ecosystems of companies providing services. And then you basically are using data from somebody else, wrapping that up in your own services, and then provide these services to yet another party. And that makes responsibility of that service a very tricky issue. So who is actually responsible for what when you're basing a decision on a certain service, when that service is actually built up of so many different parts? And what you see is that in the classical approach, there's almost always still a single party that is sort of controlling the platform that we are working on. So think about, for example, Facebook or Uber or Airbnb. They are all centralized parties, and they are managing their ecosystem. So if I would translate that to traffic, and I would look at an intersection, then basically I have an intersection, and you have a lot of users of that intersection, and then Facebook or Airbnb would actually be controlling the traffic lights on that intersection. But with complexity rising, that model starts to fail, because we don't trust these parties if these questions become too complex. And the fake news is a very good example of that. We are perfectly happy to trust Facebook that they put our pictures up for the right persons, right? But we are not happy to trust Facebook to decide what news is real and what news is fake, because that's of another level of complexity. So the way to solve that is actually to build ecosystems that are not centered around a single party, but are actually interactions between several parties. And there's also a traffic model for that. We call it a roundabout. And in a roundabout, you're able to handle far more complexity. You're able to handle different kinds of traffic. You're able to handle additional roads, all because the infrastructure is very simple, and you define some good standards that allow the users of that roundabout to make the decisions on their own. So that's the other part that you see the data analytics ecosystem moving into. They are actually trying to find these roundabouts and the standards that belong with them. And there are very good examples of good successes that you achieve in the digital world when you do that. And internet is actually the most famous one of that. So what is now the link to reporting? So if I look at the ecosystems that are appearing, I wonder if the current way of doing corporate reporting is sufficient. If I have Teslas driving on their autopilots and they're smashing into trucks, is that actually enough to have an annual report on that? Yeah? These algorithms, they are not just adding and subtracting, right? These are self-learning algorithms. Are the current ways of doing reporting enough to actually put constraints on self-learning algorithms and make sure that you can assure how they behave? I don't think so. So we are trying to find ways to actually review that process and to report on that process, and you actually see several elements. First of all, of course, you need a framework that sets how you are actually going to assure these algorithms. Within that framework, you need some review process that we are trying to define. And the final thing that you need there is, in case these algorithms are introduced in these cars, you need some sort of document, we now call it an analysis document, that actually explains how you can make sure that that algorithm that is in that car is actually trusted. So these are the most direct links that I currently see of our work associated with corporate reporting. So if I then conclude a couple of conclusions, then I start making points like this, right? So corporate reporting will be about algorithms that determine the real value of the organization. You can say, okay, we want reporting on financials, but we've seen over the past year, for example, that if you do something with CO2 emissions, and you are a car manufacturer, and you make an algorithm that actually tunes that in case you do the measurements rather than drive the car outside, that can have a huge impact on the value that you have as an organization, even though that algorithm doesn't have anything to do with the financial reporting, right? So the key value in the organizations is within the algorithms and not in their financial reporting. These corporate reports, they need to be real-time. So there's no need for annual reports. If you have an annual report that tells you that your Tesla is smashing into a truck because you have an algorithm upgrade, then you're a year too late, right? And trust will be determined by the governance, the ethics, the reliability. So they need to be into this corporate reporting. I mean, otherwise you create an ecosystem and you don't have the trust to actually make sure that you can use these algorithms properly. And the final point is then that accountants will have to shift their assurance from the financial data to the algorithms, because they really contain the risk of these organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that was a kind of a different perspective, Sander, as compared to what we had today. Okay. As you announced and we asked you for, so thank you very much for that different perspective. Now let's move back to completely, I must say, to reporting. Alain Deckers, you just arrived. Thank you very much for being here. From the perspective of the EU and looking at the digital future, most interested to hear your views on where this all goes. And maybe you would even link to Sander, we'll see.
Well, I can make one link, which is I now know why I only wear blue shirts, because I once bought a blue shirt online, and I now only get adverts for blue shirts when I go online. And and it looks like, by the looks of it, most of the men in this room actually also once bought a blue or grey suit and ended up always buying blue or grey suits. So thanks God we've got some women amongst us who've put some colour into our lives. Well, thank you very much. I want to sort of have a broad brush look at the issue of digitization of what I think we can call company report or corporate reporting, because it's no longer just about financial reporting, which has been the way that we've traditionally thought it. And one of my objectives before I move on to another job is to change the name of my unit, which is in the Commission, which is still accounting and financial reporting. And I really want to change that, because I think it just doesn't reflect the reality of where we are today, as you've been discussing for most of the day today. But let me start by reading a couple of quotes from some reports that I got my hands on. The first report dates from 1975. It's called the Corporate Report, and it was a discussion paper published for comment by the Accounting Standards Steering Committee in the UK. And it says the following, somewhere in paragraph 5.2. It says, at the present time, economic entities usually fulfill their reporting responsibilities by publishing printed reports. It is likely that new means of communication will become practical alternatives in the future, but we have not examined these possibilities in detail. That was in 1975. And if I look at the Cogito paper that Accountants in Europe has just published, there's no page numbers. No, yes, there is a page number. It's page 8. Some preparers, investors, legislators, and other parties anticipate that online corporate reporting will become the new normal in the future. So, sort of suggesting along the same lines. But we indeed expect to move away from traditional paper PDF reporting format. So I guess we're 45 years later. We're kind of, still thinking about it. There's been some progress in the level of detail of our thoughts. But what this perhaps shows is that the paper from the Accounting Standards Steering Committee was really a visionary paper all those years ago, 47 years ago, something like that. 42 years ago. So, so a good report published back then. But just to come back to my notes now, what I'd like to talk about today is not so much what we have in the legislation today, because we have already some provisions in EU law, and Roxana mentioned them earlier. There's various bits and pieces in the Transparency Directive, on the Single European Electronic Format, on the European Access Point, and so on. And those are all fine, but they are still fairly limited or not based on the latest technological developments. And I say limited, for example, the way we're currently developing SF is only for the sort of core part of consolidated reports. It's not for individual reports. It's not for legal entity reports. It's not for half-yearly reports. It's not for a lot of the ongoing information that's regulated by the Transparency Directive. And that information also remains fragmented. The infrastructure which we have today in Europe to provide that information to users, principally investors, is not interoperable. And so there is quite a lot of work to do. And I don't want to talk about what lawyers called de lege lata, which is what the law says today, but I'd like to think ahead about what we would like to do, the lege ferenda, which is, how we really like the law to be. And I hope I've got those the right way around, because I'm not a lawyer myself, and I'm just borrowing these Latin terms from some lawyers who I talked to in the past. So what should we be aiming for in terms of digitization? I think what we should be aiming for is, in a general sense, making information available as widely as possible and in as user-friendly format as possible. And that, for me, means a number of things. First of all, I think it inevitably means that we need to work towards structured data that is based on open standards. I know that some people are attached to PDF files, but I really don't think that PDF files are anymore, certainly not the cutting edge of digitization. They're really paper documents in another form. And they don't lend themselves, for example, to algorithmic processing of data unless you embed structured data into the PDF file, which is possible, but then PDF by itself is not enough. And if you think about the way that users today access information about companies, in particular financial information, many of them, I think the majority, more than half, I would say, get most or all of their data from third-party providers. They go to Bloomberg's, they go to Thomson Reuters. Those are the two big players that have about 50% of the market, I think. I think the only other significant player is a subsidiary of S&P that has about a 5% market share. And each one of them actually does take the data that comes from the information that comes from financial reports, processes it, put some kind of structure onto that information and data, but that structure is proprietary. It is not based on open standards. It works as a bit of a black box. You don't really know what is going on behind the scenes. And it is quite costly to access it. I think anybody who's ever taken out a subscription for a Bloomberg service knows that it doesn't come cheap. So as good as those services no doubt are, and they must be good because people keep paying for them, they do have certain limitations from a public policy point of view. And if I can make the link between the way that users use data from, in particular, financial data from companies, and the way that auditors are increasingly working with data, accounting data from companies in terms of audit analytics, clearly the need for a proper structuring of data becomes all the more important. The second point I'd like to emphasize, and there's really only 2 points, so you don't need to worry about time, is the need for open access. When you look at the way that we currently require companies to disseminate their information, for listed companies, it's through these peculiarly named, officially appointed mechanisms, and for non-listed companies, it's generally through business registers, often through commercial courts. These operate along very different business models. Some of them provide information for free, some of them charge in different ways and for different reasons. And also the extent to which they have moved towards making information available in electronic format varies a lot. On the whole, it's still, again, a PDF world. And I think given where we are today, that isn't really enough, and we need to look beyond that. So by way of conclusion, because I think time is limited, I'd like to highlight 3 points. First of all, digitization is not just, or not even mainly, about technology. It's about what do we want to achieve with it. And a few years ago, I was in charge of electronic procurement and trying to bring, as I always said, public procurement from the 19th century straight into the 21st century with skipping the 20th century. And that was really a point that a lot of people made at that time, that if you just digitize your procedures without thinking about your procedures, without thinking about what you're trying to achieve, what's going to happen is that you're just going to make the same mistake a lot faster. And that's not what you want to do. So we need to think about some fairly fundamental aspects of what we're trying to achieve with corporate reporting, and about the way we set up the associated infrastructure, and the way, in some ways, that business models in this area operate. The second point I think I'd like to highlight is that we really need to try and work towards a system where we're serving the needs of as broad as possible a range of users. And that doesn't necessarily only mean investors and capital providers. There's a difference of opinion between the IARC and the GRI, I think, about who are the users of the reports that they refer to in their standards or in their frameworks. And this is a live debate, right? How do we handle this? But my general approach would be to say, let's try and do a sort of a one-shot thing that allows us to meet as broad the needs of as broad a set of stakeholders as possible. In this context, I think the sort of core and more concept that Accountancy Europe has been working on is certainly an interesting one. I'm not suggesting by saying that this is the be-all and end-all, and that everything is ready to go. Clearly, there's a lot more work that needs to be done to nail down the details, but I do commend Accountancy Europe for having had the prescience to try and push the boundary in terms of what might be possible. And even if it doesn't turn out to be the actual answer in the end, it's certainly, I think, a very useful source of inspiration for all of us who end up sitting behind desks and thinking about how we're going to write legislation and public policy in this area. So thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much. So now we had the second perspective on digitization, and the third will be again from another angle, as we talked throughout the day on this corporate reporting lab, as if that was something really new and really innovative. And in a way, of course, it is, but in the UK, they invented it already, I think, like 6 years ago. So we can learn a lot from the UK Financial Reporting Lab. Interesting also to hear, Phil, your views on where this technology world and the future will go for corporate reporting based on research, I think, that you have done. So please, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I guess I'm the driver of the bus in the UK, to carry on the analogy, but although I've only recently got my driving license, so forgive me. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me along today to speak about the work of the Financial Reporting Lab, and particularly the work that we're currently doing on the digital future. And it certainly goes to some of the things that the core and more concept is talking about as well. I thought I'd just start with by recounting a couple of recent conversations I've had. The first one was with an investor relations director of a major FTSE 100 company in the UK, and the second conversation was a conversation I had with my 9-year-old daughter, who, of course, will always tell me what really needs to be done with corporate reporting. So the first conversation with the investor relations director is, and we were talking about how they pull together their annual report. And of course, in investor relations, it's a central role in pulling together all the different strands of financial and non-financial reporting. And he said a few years ago, someone on the board had the good idea to say, well, as well as producing the annual report, which is about 250 pages long, perhaps it would be useful to explain the strategy of the company specifically to those who are interested. And he said, fine, we'll pull together a nice glossy document which will contain the strategic report, sets out the strategy. Brilliant. Went down very well. Second year, another board member has a good idea. What about producing something for our employees? Explaining to them what the relevant parts of the annual report. So they put together another nice little glossy brochure of, what's relevant in the annual report to them. The third year, we then think about customers. This particular company is very focused on its customers, so let's put another glossy report together. And he said, with this non-financial reporting directive, crikey, how many of these reports am I actually going to have to produce and send out to all these relevant stakeholders? Of course, one of the answers to that is you don't have to. One of the answers is to actually do things digitally so that you're targeting the information to the user's needs, and to use the technologies that are in place or may be in place in the future to be able to do that. So the second conversation was my 9-year-old daughter. And she said to me one day when I came back to work, she said, "Daddy, why have you got so much paper in your bag when you come home?" And I said to her, rather patronizingly, as you do to children, I said, "Well, I get homework just like you do when you come home from school." And she said to me, "Yes, Daddy, but I don't bring a load of paper home. I just go on the computer and I do my homework on the computer." And actually, that did sort of say to me, well, in the future, you know, people are not going to consume information on paper. And kids of today, the millennials of today, are actually using and consuming information very differently. And I think the corporate reporting world needs to respond to that as we go forward. What she also said, of course, is you can search data on the computer. You know, you don't have to read through the whole thing. Of course. Yeah. Which brings me to what we've been doing in the financial reporting lab. As I said, and I think we've covered this already, there are several drivers of change going forward in the digital space. The first one, and we've talked about it before in the last session, is regulation. The European Single Electronic Format, the SEC requirement for foreign private issuers to file electronically by the end of this year, and the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which drives consideration of other users. The users I've talked about, my 9-year-old daughter, plus others who may be interested in corporate reporting, increasing different demands from other stakeholders on reporting, and the changing balance of investment. And we've talked about many of those things already today. And then on the technology side, for years we've been talking about the future of technology in corporate reporting, and Alain talked a little bit about the report from 47 years ago, but you know, we've been talking about this for a long time. But actually, I think there really is technology which can help us to produce corporate reporting more digitally in the future, and investors are starting to use some of technology to consume information. So the preparers also need to be able to do that as well and start to experiment more with digital reporting in the future. So what have we done in the lab? Well, one of the things that when we started exploring what the digital future might look like in the financial reporting lab, we really could take two approaches. You could take a look at the technologies that are available at the moment and try and assess how they can be used for the future of digital reporting or future digital reporting methods. Or we could take the second approach, which was actually to ask those preparing the information, those responsible for distributing the information and storing it, national storage mechanisms, and those responsible for using the information, investors and others, to establish this, what we call characteristics of future digital reporting. So rather than focusing on the technologies first, we wanted to focus on the characteristics that future technologies really needed to step up to the mark and address some of these areas. And we put out this what we call the framework of characteristics of good future digital reporting. And the framework, we put out a report earlier this year, which sets out the framework from the perspective of the producers, which is the top line there, from those distributing the information, which is the middle line, and those at the bottom consuming the information, the users of corporate information. Now, from a production point of view, obviously what companies and corporates are really concerned about is if we're going to put all this effort into digital reporting, is it going to be cost effective? Is it going to be used by the users, and is it going to be useful? Also, is it going to be compatible with our existing financial and corporate reporting systems, or is it going to be something that we have to bolt on once we've produced our PDF document? And then distributors. Clearly, it's important to get the information out as quickly as possible, so it needs to be prompt, it needs to be compliant with the current frameworks, and of course it needs to be freely accessible. And that's obviously important when we're comparing it to some of the other data aggregators, such as Bloomberg and Thomson Reuters. And then on the consumption side, it's important that the users of that information, it is engaging, but also it's understandable. It's understandable and and the users of information understand the context in which the information is presented, i.e. is this within an IFRS framework or a different framework, and we've talked about some of the other frameworks in corporate reporting today as well. And also, can we rely on the information that we're looking at? Currently, it's not audited, ex-BRL, but maybe it could be. Maybe there are some checks which, in the future, users can actually rely on that information more so than they can at the current time. So that was really this characteristics of digital framework, digital reporting was there to assess different technologies and see the extent to which they met the characteristics. What we're finding is we're holding a number of round tables, and the way that the lab works, we've talked about the sort of lab today before, but the way the lab works, it engages with companies, investors and others, and technology companies in the case of this project, and starts to think about the different solutions to corporate reporting. So we've held a series of round tables, or we are holding a series of round tables with technology companies to look at their technologies and assess it against the framework of characteristics. We started off with XBRL, but we'll be looking at artificial intelligence, blockchain, and some of the other technologies, and seeing their relevance for the corporate reporting future. What we have learned so far in the project is that there is no one solution which is going to answer all of the digital future that we set out, or all of the characteristics that we've set out. But actually, technologies will need to work together. And existing technologies actually have a lot to offer if they work together effectively. And that's really what we're calling for this project, is to find a way to galvanize the technology companies, regulators, companies and investors together to find a future technological solution to a good way of reporting digitally in the future. So that's really where the aim of this project is. We intend to complete further roundtables throughout the rest of this year and issue a sort of blueprint for the future early next year. That's the goal of the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we have three, as I already said, I think three really different perspectives here. I'm not sure we're going to have conversations all between us, although there's one that I thought that would be interesting to get back on, because Sander, you said as in your introduction, one of the points was the information in the future needs to be real time. And with technology, we could enable real time. So I think one of the questions with technology is, do we stick to that 1 year reporting or quarterly reporting, or do we all think that it needs to have at least a higher frequency, apart from whether that's really real time? And maybe, Phil, you have already insights on that, where you said prompt. You may have heard that from the distributors and the users, and Alain, you may have a view from the EU perspective.
Oh, sorry, I thought you said.
Yeah, but Sander already suggested it to be real time, so maybe.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question, and the answer is not easy. And the reason I say that is I would sort of go back to some of the characteristics of reporting, and some of the things that we hear from users, investors, is that they want information that they can trust and that is assured. And therefore, the future sort of utopian situation of real-time reporting actually relies on the fact that, what assurance have you got over the data that you're sharing with investors? And whilst I think that the audit firms are certainly moving in the more direction of sort of more constant assurance, I think there's still quite a long way to go until we get there. So again, if I would go back to some of the characteristics of reporting that we've identified, I think it's thinking about how continuous data and continuous reporting would fit into some of the needs of certainly investors.
Yeah, I think that's one side. The other side is, when does that information actually lose its value?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
And with that, Sander, you would also suggest different forms of reporting. I mean, not like an annual report or a structured way, but also in a way.
Yeah, but I think both the other speakers already commented on that the current form of publishing PDF reports is not the way that you would like to do.
Exactly, yeah.
I just come back on the question of the frequency. I think the question of frequency is not necessarily the objective, as you no doubt know. Some time ago, we amended the Transparency Directive to remove the requirement for quarterly reporting, although it's still possible, for example, for stock exchanges to require that. Certainly from a legal point of view, it's no longer a requirement of the Transparency Directive. And there's a lively debate going on at the moment in the high-level group on sustainable finance on this topic, where there is clearly amongst some parties still a concern that even though, as I said, the Transparency Directive no longer requires quarterly reporting, that this is still a prevailing market practice, and that this has an impact on the way that investors think about the longer term. So that's something that needs to be thought of. I think Phil's point about assurance is a very good one. Clearly, you don't want to put any old data out there. I think if we're going to go in this direction, we need to think very carefully about also what the role of auditors is. Clearly with audit analytics, potentially, and the use of, I am told by large audit firms, the increasing use of artificial intelligence or the incipient use of artificial intelligence, you have potentially a way of getting there and of providing some assurance. But that then raises some pretty big questions about what the role of the auditor actually is, because auditors clearly are no longer going to be doing a lot of the sampling work and sort of risk management work that they were doing in the past. And they may even become sort of certifiers of into artificial intelligence algorithms that then sort of crunch the data by themselves. And then that raises questions about, how do we know whether an algorithm is independent or not? And lots of very sort of almost philosophical questions, but questions which are nevertheless important in this area. So I think there are lots of questions and challenges in this area. Personally, I mean, I'm aware that there have already been some experiments in this area. There have been some companies who have tried to provide on their website some sort of a live feed of at least part of their financial information, and I've always thought that the day that Google and SAP talk to each other, for example, they're going to have a lot of fun and put a lot of people out of business, because they have the kind of technology and the know-how to handle these kind of things. So potentially there's a lot of exciting developments ahead of us. But we need to be cautious about what they mean, and I've given a couple of examples with assurance, which I agree with Phil, and also about the impact on long-term investment, for example. So there are public policy issues that we need to think about very carefully.
We are a bit circling around auditing and assurance today. We have touched on it a few times. A few speakers have talked about it. This conference is about reporting, so not about assurance and audit. But this is now, I think, about the 5th time I hear about it. So I think, honestly, we're not going to touch on it in detail, but I think it is important to understand from you, where we have talked about reporting, what is the one thing that Accountancy Europe should do as the European Organization of Accountants in relation to this future developments and with an eye to audit. Is there anyone who can say anything about it?
I mean, one of the things I've been sort of saying since sort of getting involved in this project is how can we find a way, particularly to get companies engaged in the digital arena? Because I think at the moment companies perhaps see the introduction of the European single electronic format as a compliance burden rather than a real sort of opportunity to report in a better way and in a way that is actually going to be used effectively by the users. And I think one of the things that Accountancy Europe and other bodies could really do is try and get companies and investors together, as we try and do in the Financial Reporting Lab, and really move away from, yes, we've got to do this by 2020, but actually how can we use that and possibly go even further than the compliance requirements to really think about how we can make this information useful and used by investors.
Any views from you, Alain? Or?
Well, I just encourage you to sort of continue being creative and coming up with clever ideas. I think there are not a lot of people who, there are a number of people who invest in this area, but I think your work in this area has been particularly creative. And again, I don't know that it's going to be the answer, but at least it is a good discussion, and it is a good idea to throw out there. So that's one thing, and I'd certainly agree with what Phil's just said. When I talk and meet with representative of, in particular, preparers, I do sense this kind of fear and reluctance and concern that this is just a terrible compliance issue. And my message is always the same one, is look, don't make this a rearguard battle to try and prevent this from happening, because it's going to happen. And rather than that, try and get ahead of the curve, try and see how you can make this a success and use it for your own advantage. That's what I would say.
And what I understand from you, Sander, is auditors are actually looking at the wrong things. We should look at algorithms and...
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if you look at auditing and corporate reporting on digitization, the whole thing is way too complex to go from start to finish in one go. So you need some agile approach where you basically start working together on what this should look like. And I think you cannot do that by separating corporate reporting from audit and assurance. So you need some combined team to actually find out what this beast should look like.
Right.
And then take little steps.
Yeah. We also discussed today the corporate reporting lab, and we heard your story on your latest research, but now we're here. We might learn from the financial reporting lab in any respect. I mean, governance, approach, whatever. What is the learnings you can share with all of us here? Some of us is going to initiate this, that has been promised today. So what can we learn from it when we initiate that?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is it's an incredibly exciting move for Accountancy Europe to do this, and this is something that we in the Financial Reporting Lab in the UK are very, very supportive of. We've been looking to collaborate with other equivalent lab organisations, and so we're incredibly supportive of what you're suggesting. I think in terms of learning points, I think Paul George made the comment earlier around the decision to put the Financial Reporting Lab within the accountancy regulator, the Financial Reporting Council. And I do think that's pretty important to have that kind of layer of, if you like, sort of credibility for the work that we do. And actually it does help businesses really respond positively to the initiatives that we do. Having said that, it's also very important to stress that when you're asking companies and investors to come in and contribute to the project work that we do, it's very important to stress that it's a safe environment, and actually the regulatory part of the FRC is not going to be kind of looking in at the door and thinking, well, what are these companies doing that we don't particularly like? So we very much create this safe environment where companies can explore with reporting issues. We don't seek to create regulation. What we do seek to do is drive best practice through illustrating good examples and creating good examples. Now, obviously, we don't create good examples which don't comply with the rules, and one benefit of being in the FRC is that we can actually check that before we put it out. But that is what I would encourage: is first of all finding a way to create the safe environment so that companies do come in, and we regularly get really good contributions from companies. We're running a project at the moment on risk and viability reporting, and we've got 23 companies ranging from FTSE 100s down to sort of smaller listed companies involved in that project, and a similar number of investors. And they have the confidence that it is a safe environment and also a useful environment for them to connect with their investors. So the first thing I would say is the safe environment. The second thing is how do you get the message out there in a credible way, and being attached to the FRC allows us to do that. And I think that's the second thing that perhaps to take away, is finding an organisation that can provide that level of credibility endorsement. I don't like to say endorsement, but you know the sort of thing I don't create another endorsement process, but you know what I mean. Therefore, to give weight to the findings that you're producing. The third thing I'd probably say is it might seem like a great big resource, the Financial Reporting Lab, but actually the whole of the Financial Reporting Lab is here. It's myself and Thomas sat over there. So actually it's quite a small level of resource, and the reason for that is we don't express our own views on anything. We only express the views of the participants, the companies and investors in our projects. And so it's very much a sort of coordination role, if you like. So actually, if you think it's a sort of scary level of resource that needs to happen, actually that's not necessarily the case. We also have a very good steering group, which sort of represents the participants in the market. So we have investors on that, and companies and regulators and all the sort of main players in the corporate reporting market. Right. So those are the three things I would say. Don't be scared about the resources, safe environment, and find a way of making it credible and well received.
We turn to Hans, I think, for a comment or a question.
Yes, in your arm.
In your.
I have the thing, but the armrest.
Yeah, you should push the.
Okay, thank you. Standard setters and technology, it doesn't really go together. Observation more than a question. As I said in my introductory words this morning, I'm not so worried that artificial intelligence and big data is going to put us out of business, not for the time being at least. But it is absolutely going to give a lot more real-time, very actual, market-orientated information to those who can afford to buy artificial intelligence and big data. And it's expensive, so especially to players like hedge funds, etc., etc. I think that has a consequence for accounting standard setting as well, because if the accounting standards do not sufficiently reflect market developments and are for example, based on historical cost, where there are readily market values available, for example, for equity investments, then we would create a huge unlevel playing field for those hedge funds who don't need our standards to get that information about market values out of their big data or just following the market. And the unwitting investor who relies on our standards and thinks that everything is stable because the accounting reflects artificial stability. So I think it is, this is not a plea to introduce on a grand scale fair value accounting, but it does say, I do mean to say that we have to be very careful to push back on fair value accounting there where there are readily market values available for example, financial instruments.
Right, and actually you also put a plea for open access information so that we keep that level playing field.
That as well, yeah. That's why we work on our taxonomy.
I'm checking just whether there are any other comments or questions from the audience on technology. Everything you always wanted to ask. Not yet. I have, Sander, you named it in your list of 4 at the end, but I think it's good to just a little stress it, where you said, well, so we need information reporting on the algorithms, because it can be the success or the failure of a company, as well as the related governance. And then Alain said, and by the way, we're going to audit what is then the independence of the algorithms. So what are your views on that, or points you want to share on that in relation to corporate reporting?
One of the things that I'm really wondering about, also seeing the other discussions going on today, is about transparency. I think it's even in the slogan of the summit today. What we are finding out is that if you're basing decisions on AI, then explainability becomes an issue. And that could be a problem if you're talking about corporate reporting. But sometimes I wonder if it really is, because in the end, it's not transparency what we're looking for, but it's trust. And trust you can generate in different ways. I mean, many of us just have blind trust in something because of experience, because of reputation, because of brand. It's only a few experts that really need to have informed information, have to have informed trust, basically. So I wonder how I would see that back in reporting when we are talking about reporting on digital. Because I don't think that it's a very good idea to start explaining how an AI algorithm works. I don't think that you're serving anybody with that, except maybe for a handful of experts. So it's more like a question than a statement, but I really wonder what way that goes.
Yeah, yeah. But as you suggested with one of your example, it could be that Tesla, which we heard about this morning, by the way, could go bankrupt essentially because they they misprogrammed or intentionally or not.
It's not even future, right? If you look at what happened to Volkswagen with the CO2 emissions.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't go bankrupt, but it had a significant financial impact, and it had nothing to do with an algorithm related to financial reporting.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
But I just want to say, even those technical issues can have fairly major consequences. If I make the analogy to models that large banks use for calculation of regulatory capital, for example, that has fairly significant implications if they get it wrong. And essentially these models, to me, look largely like black boxes. Yeah. I shouldn't perhaps be saying this if there are supervisors in the room, but I'm not even always entirely sure how supervisors get their heads around these internal models. Yeah. And they are supposed to be the experts. Yeah. So I think it does raise big questions about ultimately related to trust indeed, but trust that can have, lack of trust can have fairly dramatic consequences. If you have a large systemic bank going bust because the auditor's algorithm got it wrong on checking their whatever derivative exposures or whatever, and the supervisor didn't see it either.
I guess my main question then is, okay, if this is such a big issue, then where is the responsibility to fix it?
Exactly. We're gonna close off this day. We're gonna also close off this session. I would like to put to each of you as a kind of a final comment, a question, and I was triggered by you, Alain, where you talked about structured data. And you in all kind of ways talked about big data. And when I hear data, I get concerned about the story. So my last question to you is, fantastic, the data and the structured data, but what about the story?
Yeah, but I think, first of all, there are tremendous advances being made in terms of processing natural language. That's something that is a very exciting area of technology. But I think structured doesn't just mean numbers. It can also refer to text, and you can label text so that also you can process that text algorithmically, or at least you can have an easy way of picking apart and identifying which is the bit of the text that you're actually interested in finding. And certainly, for example, if you look at again, I'm going to pick on banks, the annual reports of large banks. I'm not going to name any that start with H, but that have very, very large reports. And if you want to try and find the bit of information that you're particularly interested in, and it may be actually a fairly important bit of information, but it's going to be buried in footnote 325 on page 416, that could be an issue. And certainly for an analyst who's getting this thing and has a matter of 10 to 15 minutes, or maybe a little bit more, to put out something intelligent to the clients on the day that the things are being published, that's an issue. And I think their structured data or structured standards for structured information and data can also provide a help.
Okay, information rather than data.
Information.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think the worst thing that can happen with digital is that we don't allow companies to tell their story and explain the strategy and explain how they're driving value. But I don't see digital as the blocker for that at all. I completely agree with Alain. And investors are already analysing unstructured data, tweets, other communications that are being put out by companies, and finding a way to do that. And as you say, you can tag anything in the corporate report. and there will be ways in which that data can be analysed. So I think the storytelling is still a very, very important part of corporate reporting, but I don't see a digital framework standing in the way of that.
I think the sorry. I'm getting emotional.
It's okay.
Don't mention the word
We're with
data
you.
in your
We're with you.
I think the story is in the end getting more important because there's so much data out there that it becomes worthless to actually look at all of it. So you're looking into the story. It's connected to the trust versus transparency thing that I just said. You don't need to have full transparency in all the data because it doesn't mean anything anymore.
Right.
So you have a few experts that actually dig into it, create a good report of it, and then if they tell the right story, then that's what's generating trust and not the underlying data.
Good, thank you very much. With that, I'd like to close, and please thank with me Sander Klous, Fitz-Gerald, Alain Deckers.